The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is G.Edward Griffin, the author, filmmaker, and researcher. You are the founder of Freedom Force International and the creator of the Red Pill University, with the mission to popularize a global coalition for the victory of individualism over collectivism and liberty over tyranny. You've written a number of best-selling books, including The Creature from Jekyll Island, which looks at the secret formation of the Federal Reserve and inspired a number of leading thinkers, including our friend Robert Kiyosaki. You were a central figure in the recently released documentary film Plandemic 3, The Great Awakening, where you discussed how communism is taking over America in a war to control the minds of the people. Ultimately, you believe that we must act now to stop the central bankers from destroying our freedoms and ushering in a new monetary system that will leave the vast majority of us with nothing. Ed, welcome to London Real.
Well, thank you for that great and succinct introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I think I'll start with the way a lot of people here probably know who you are, and that was this incredible presence you had in Mickey Willis's recent film, The Great Awakening, which is also known as Plandemic 3. We've actually had Mickey on the show, and Dr. Martin and Dell. We actually had all of them back on the show 3 years ago, and we helped live stream the first Plandemic, the second Plandemic, and we also live streamed the one you were in. And so I think a lot of our viewers will be very familiar with your major presence in that film. And, you know, it was very powerful, Ed, you know, to see you in these kind of, I think they were colorized versions of black and white film that I believe you made happen a very long time ago. And then to have you come to life in the end of the film and go even deeper, it was really powerful. I would say everybody go watch this film. They can watch it on our Freedom platform at freedomplatform.tv. It's available elsewhere. But can you tell me a little bit about the film, some of the things you were talking about, and just what people can expect if they haven't yet seen it?
Well, you're talking about the recent film, but not the old ones.
Yeah, well, maybe both, because a lot of those old ones are featured, you know.
Yeah, I think to understand the current one, you have to understand those old ones, because that's really my origin. That's my roots. I caught fire. I discovered what the world was really like about 1960. Just a young guy, and I was in the corporate world. I had gone to school. I thought I was going to be into communications and acting and all that sort of thing. I went to school to have fun, you know, like a lot of people do. And I did have a lot of fun. I didn't learn too much, thank God, looking back in retrospect, because even at that time at the universities, they were teaching some pretty garbagey stuff, and I wasn't paying any attention. But anyway, I was having fun. I thought I'd be going to radio and television, and I did work in a television station, and I had my own radio shows and all that as a young guy. So I came out to Hollywood thinking that was going to be my life, and I discovered then that, well, there were a lot of young people there with talents much greater than mine, and they were washing cars and bussing dishes and waiting for that big moment, you know. By this time I was married. I had one child and half of one on the way. And I thought I was running out of money. I said, this is not working. I think I better get a real job. So I went into the corporate world, and that's where we pick up the story. And I was climbing the corporate ladder. Then I came across some pamphlets and some literature that was sort of thrust at me. Didn't have much interest in it. But the first one I remember was a little blue booklet about the United Nations, revealing the secret truth about the United Nations. And of course, I was offended deeply because I knew that the United Nations was our last best hope for peace. I knew that because I had learned that in school. Well, this pamphlet was saying that that was not true. So I got incensed and I went to the library and did some original research, which surprised me. But I was curious about that. And I soon discovered from the books I read, mostly from pro-UN sources, that this pamphlet was right. There was a lot of chicanery going on there, a lot of deception, and it just jolted me. I discovered I had a crusader gene, and all of a sudden I was thinking about something other than myself. I was thinking about more than just, well, how much money am I going to make? How am I looking? What kind of a house am I living in? A nice enough car? All those materialistic things. All of a sudden, I began to be indignant about the fact that I was being lied to about something so important as the future of our country and the future of the world. And all of a sudden, I had this crusader gene rattling, and so I quit my job at the big corporate. It was a big insurance company, actually. It was Equitable Life Assurance Society. And I decided I was going to use what skills I had in the field of communications to do some agitating and some spreading of the truth of what I was learning. So I started to produce some very low budget documentary films. Now we're into the track here. Very low budget. First, we started with film strips, as they called them in those days, which a series of still pictures on a roll of 35 millimeter film. And you set up the projector in the auditorium and you start to play a recording. And that was the soundtrack. And at periodic points in the recording, there'd be a beep sound. And that's when the operator would turn the knob to the next frame. And it worked pretty good, but that was all we had. That was really low budget. And then we got really good. We got a couple of $1,000 donated to us, or invested, I should say, in us to produce a 16 millimeter film. So that's when we started to use 16 millimeter black and white film. And we couldn't afford a studio, so we used my living room in my home as the studio. And it's a very small living room, but it looks pretty big in the video. We moved most of the furniture out and brought in some chairs where people could sit. We had our own little real audience there. Some of my family, some of my neighbors, some of my friends, some strangers we didn't know about. And so that's what we did. We recorded my presentation sitting on a bar stool in my living room before a group of about maybe 22 people, 25 people. And we plunged into some pretty deep stuff. And that's how it all started. And I made it a beginning with that. These films were, whether cumbersome, they came in cases, and if you had a 90-minute film presentation, it usually required 2 rolls of film, and that had to be developed, and it was expensive. And by that I mean, in those days, I think we sold those for about $350, which is a huge amount of money. So obviously we didn't sell a lot of them, but we sold enough to make our money back and produce another film, which is how this whole thing started. So in those days, I talked about the grand design, which was the communist revolution. Well, the grand design, really, I got that backwards, was about our foreign policy. And the one about communist revolution was called More Deadly Than War. And I did some things like that. And they were all in black and white. And naturally, most people were not interested in what I was saying. I don't think it had too much to do with my inability to capture their attention. It's just that in those days, things were good. Who was worried about communism in America? Why, you got to be kidding. That's never going to happen in America. So people weren't interested. And I could see that the strategy that I had learned about was under play already. A little backstory on that might be of interest to your viewers. Is when I first started to become interested in these issues, I had a lot to learn. I sort of fell into the pattern that most people at that time were in who were concerned of these issues. And that pattern was to be concerned about communism. Well, there was good reason for that, because if you remember, back in those days, communism was taking over the world, had already taken Russia, had taken the Middle East, the Eastern Europe, it had taken Cuba, and it was working very actively in South America, Latin America, and we had a communist party in the United States. So all of a sudden you think, my gosh, well, these guys are serious. They're planning on taking over the world. So I became very concerned and interested in communism. What's this all about? I didn't understand it. So I decided I would go down to the communist bookstore in Los Angeles. It was called the People's Bookshop down at Larchmont Street. And for all I know, it's still there. I don't know, but it was there then, and it had a strange group of people in there. Some looked fairly normal, but a lot of them were more of the hippie types, and the young comrades were in there volunteering their services. So I walked in. Of course, I've got my business suit on. I got my sideburns and the narrow tie. I'm strictly from the corporate world, and I felt really out of place in that bookstore, but they welcomed me. They tried to recruit me into the party. They invited me to some study groups, I think they called them. They were recruiting funnels. And so I wanted to learn about communism. I really did. So I bought a lot of books. In fact, I think I bought all of them. I still have them in my library, and I actually read them. I say actually read them because I discovered quickly that most of the comrades down there had not read them. They were selling them, but they had not read them. Their level of understanding of Marxism, or Marxism-Leninism, as another branch of it is called, was very shallow. These guys and women were working on slogans, and just slogans mostly, and illusions, and it all sounded good, like from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. It's a nice slogan. What's wrong with that? Who could possibly be opposed to that? It's the basis of Christian charity, isn't it? Let's be against war and fascism and no exploitation of the poor and so forth. Let's bring peace to the world and get rid of racism and all these things. Well, let's sign me up. Let's go. But that's where the comrades were at in the bookstore. But I read their stuff, and I actually read the collected works of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And that's where you really get into the sticky stuff. Lenin was the theoretician of the Communist Party. Marx had nothing to do with the Communist Party. He was just a writer, a theoretician, an ideologue, and most of his ideas weren't his at all, I found out later. He was merely repeating what he had heard from others. But his book got published, and so his name is attached to those ideas. But they're all ideas, and I learned quickly that no country had ever fallen to Marxism. No country had ever fallen to the theories of Karl Marx in Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, because it was all theory about social order and economics and markets and things and exploitation of the worker. It was all the hype to get people angry and say, we've got to do something better than that. Where you really get into the nitty-gritties is where you start to read Lenin. Now, Lenin was a Marxist, of course. That was the foundation of his whole ideology. But he came to the very practical conclusion that theoreticians don't come to power. Militants come to power. People with guns and bayonets come to power, but not people who write books. And he said, comrades, our objective is not to win a debate. Our objective is to come to power. And so he formed the Communist Party and developed strategies and tactics, not to win debates or to win the hearts and the minds of the people, but to come to power. And that's where you really learn about what we're up against. Because his theme, although he was a prolific writer and wrote many, many, many essays, there was a theme that ran through almost all of them. And it went something like this. He would say, comrades, if we are trying to take over a country, and the country has a strong tradition of the culture that's different from ours, and they're strongly nationalistic, and they like their traditions, do we go into them and say, everybody, let's become internationalists and throw off your traditions and adopt communism? And he said, of course not. Don't be silly. Why, they would never do that. So what we must do is go in and say, we love these traditions. We are nationalists. We hate communists. We are anti-communists. We want to fight against communism. He said, then they will like us. Then they will support us. Then they will follow us. They will make us their leaders. And then when we become their leaders, we can betray them. And then he said, we don't have to win debates then, because if anyone disagrees with us, we shoot them. Now that in a nutshell is Lenin. And if people don't understand that, they don't understand what they're up against, because that's what the world really is being driven by. It's not communism or Marxism or socialism. It's being driven by Leninism, which is coming to power by any means whatsoever. So that's what I did. Brian, I got into all of that stuff. And you asked me, how did that happen? It just sort of one step after the other, just exploring and learning. And each step I took, and at every level of enlightenment that I was able to achieve, I became more enraged, more alarmed, more determined to get the word out about it. And that's just the pattern of my life ever since then. It's been pretty much the same, except for the fact that in those days, I had no idea how deep and how huge this topic was. Each time I learned something, I think, well, now I got it. And then I discover a month later, well, no, that was just the beginning. There's something else to learn. And that process is still going on.
Wow.
And
so
well, go ahead. I think that's enough. That probably answers your question.
No, that was fantastic. So first of all, I have a soft spot for independent media because 12 years ago, I started this program. And at the time I had YouTube, which I've struggled with for censorship recently, but we'll talk about that later. But the fact that you were able to create your own media, back in the 60s, by any means necessary with these various tools and using your living room and, barely scraping by to get the money to do it. I mean, I find that really inspiring. And obviously a lot of that was used in the Great Awakening. Fast forward 60 years ahead, why is this message relevant today? Because it clearly is, because it was a big part of that film. Why do people need to know about this today, especially in America?
Well, I think that's almost self-evident that what I was talking about back in the 60s was more in terms of, hey, everybody, if we don't stop this process, something really bad is going to happen in the future. Look over there. Don't you see those storm clouds on the horizon over there? They could come here. So that was then. And that's why most people weren't interested, because now those storm clouds are little ones and they're way away. They're not going to come over here. So now why is it relevant today is because now the storm clouds are overhead and the lightning bolts are shooting down around our bodies right now. It's here. So nobody can be so complacent anymore. And I seldom hear people say, well, that could never happen here in America, because it is happening. And it's pretty clear that we're coming to the final stages. The window of opportunity to avoid the total collapse and calamity of society and civilization, literally, is closing. The time span is narrowing. We have to act now. So even the most willfully blind person to these things has to admit that it's happening, and it's going to affect their lives very negatively if they don't do something about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I went to Boston to go to school, and I graduated in '93. And I went back to Boston last year because my daughter is going to school there, and she just visited over the summer. And I kind of asked her in passing, I'm like, are people really talking about communism there? And she's like, yeah, the students talk about it seriously, like it's a viable option. And that wasn't happening in my school in '93. I remember seeing the Che Guevara shirts, and stuff was coming out. But, it was interesting for me to hear what's actually being talked about on university campuses, let alone what you're seeing the population talk about, let alone if you start taking it down the road of, the Federal Reserve and, CBDCs and UBI and all these other things that are coming. What are the things that you're seeing that shows that there are a part of the population that is really trying to go into socialism, which maybe then goes to communism? What are the things that you see that are these lightning bolts around us? And how do you make those things clear to people as dangers?
That's a tough one to answer, because it's a tough one to know where to start. There's so many things. I think all of the all of the items that are of concern to me are destructive in nature. And by that, I mean they're destructive of those pillars of tranquility and prosperity and liberty that we've enjoyed. I've enjoyed it most of my life. I mean, I've always been free to travel wherever I wanted to. I've always been free to express an opinion, even if it was unpopular. I've always been free, to say what I want, no matter, as long as I don't lie and injure their reputation or cost them their jobs or something like that. I can say, I don't like you. I think you're a so-and-so. I don't like your attitude. You're always too negative. You're always looking for faults. I could say that. Today, I can't do that. Somebody will say, well, you hurt my feelings, and I go to prison. So that kind of thing, it wakes you up when you're used to having this thing called liberty and living in a system of freedom. And you see all these liberties and freedoms being taken away one by one, and with the approval of everyone. Everybody says, well, yeah, we don't like that, but it's necessary, for the greater good. It's necessary for society. If we don't do all these things we don't like to do, why, it's really good. Then it's really going to be bad. So in order for us to be good citizens and to do what we should do as good boys and girls, we have to go along with these tyrannical directives. That's what scares me the most, is the fact that people have conditioned themselves to think that they have to comply with this growth of tyranny because it's for the greater good of the greater number. And of course, that is one of the dictums of collectivism, is that any atrocity, any assault against our liberty, anything that's unreasonable or horrible can be justified as long as you can say that it was for the greater good. We can have false attacks on Pearl Harbor, which we did, and then we explained it to the people. Well, that was an act of statesmanship that President Roosevelt did to get us into the war, because if we had waited any longer, then the casualties of war would have been greater. And so you see, by getting into the war quicker and by deliberately killing 3,000 or 4,000 American sailors and convincing them that we didn't know about the pending attack and all that sort of thing, that was an act of statesmanship. And on it goes. You can look at 9/11. We knew that those guys were coming, and we didn't really do anything about it because we needed to get into this war against terrorism and back in the Middle East. And also we had to solidify our oil pipelines and a few things like that. So it was for the greater good, especially for the greater good of Americans. So to answer your question, I think the most alarming thing to me is that not all of these negative things that are happening, but that they're happening with so little pushback and so little concern on the part of the people that it's affecting. And they're taking it, they're accepting it because of this mantra of the greater good of the greater number. And now we're back to this issue of collectivism again, because that is one of the cornerstones of collectivism, is the false belief that these things are for the greater good.
And how did we get here? I mean, when you talk about in the 60s, how the communists are infecting all things around the world, how they plan on doing it, how they plan on stirring up social disorder. Was this them running their playbook, or was this something that also happened organically, or is this something that is going to potentially...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.